morning, everyone. Just going to take a minute to let some folks join in, but welcome. All right, I think we're ready to go. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Deardahl. I'm the director of the Middle Fork Willamette Watershed Council. Welcome to our very first Fermenting Ideas of the year. We're excited to take a deeper dive this evening with David Lewis, who gave sort of a sneak presentation at our annual celebration a couple of weeks ago. So a little bit about us. Of course, we're the Middle Fork Willamette Watershed Council, and we're happy to be bringing you this talk with David virtually this evening. If you're interested in supporting this and continuing this type of thing being brought to you in your homes and your living rooms, please consider making a donation on our website. Whatever you think is appropriate, $5, $10, $20, whatever you think is appropriate would be great. So we can continue to bring you this programming in the future. David is going to give us a very heady talk this evening. His talk is entitled Creating the Pre-Colonized Willamette Valley, Missoula Floods and the Kalapuyan Anthropocene. And he's going to say that a lot better than I have. But first, let me tell you a little bit about David for those who are new to listening to David talk. David Lewis is a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, a descendant of the Santiam, Takelma, and Chinook people of Oregon. He has a PhD from the U of O and teaches at OSU. He is a researcher, presenter, and writer of many histories of the tribes of the region, and many essays are collected on his blog site, IndianHistoryResearch.com. David lives in Salem with his wife Donna and sons Sahaley and Inatai. Did I say that right, David? I'm not sure.
Yep.
Great. All right. Without further ado, David, go ahead and take it away.
I really wanted to see if Sarah could pronounce all those words,
which I didn't do
correctly,
well.
Which you did fine, actually. Very good. Well, let me go ahead and share. I didn't want to sort of repeat what we did last time because that may be boring to some of you. And so I wanted to take it a little bit further into sort of a little bit deeper studies on the environment of the peoples that sort of lived here before the white people lived here. And so I've been really interested in the Mozilla Floods and how that they may have sort of changed their environment here as kind of a climate change in itself, and then really interested in this idea of the Anthropocene, this idea that humans have affected our environment for thousands of years. Some scholars believe that they can track the effects of human effects on the environment back perhaps 120,000 years based on things they did. And so we're going to talk about some of that right now. Let me see if I can't share this thing correctly. And okay. So I'm skipping a bunch of stuff here because I normally do this in my archaeology class, but we are moving to the sixth extinction. This Anthropocene event that we're in today, right now, is what's called also the sixth extinction. And the time period is called the Holocene, which is about 11,700 years ago before the present. That's when it begins, which is basically about the same time as farming begins, worldwide. So this Anthropocene is the human era with wide-scale human effects on the Earth's climate atmosphere, including oceans, rivers, estuaries, terrestrial landscapes, and the biodiversity of flora and faunal communities. That we can actually measure and see these effects in archaeological sites. And the beginnings are thought to be several different things by different scholars. One is the arrival of humans in any kind of new landscape or their colonization in landscapes. And that roughly begins around 70,000 years ago. And as humans are moving out of Africa into sort of Asia and other places. Also, we can measure it through global farming. Farming clearly has an effect on changing the landscape, burn down forests, remove lots of rocks, and begin to sort of spread nutrients into the soil. Tilling the soil clearly has an effect on the landscape, perhaps depleting nutrients, and these can be measured through all kinds of soil science studies. That begins some 12,000, 8,000 years ago, depending on where we're talking about. The Industrial Revolution is also a big point in measuring human effects on the land, on the earth, because what the Industrial Revolution did is a number of things. It destroyed or ate up a lot of forests, ate up a lot of wood and coal and all kinds of natural resources, and deposited those things as pollutants into our atmosphere. And so we can actually, so that all eventually filters down to the soils and the waters and glaciers. And so you can actually measure exactly when the Industrial Revolution begins in many areas of the world through I guess the soot, the ash, and the particulates that are in things like glaciers and in soils and stuff like that. And that really takes off in the 19th century. You see a big, a big impetus on, industrial growth, but, we know it all begins early 18th century, with a lot of other developments. And then also changes in river fluxes, or even some scholars think that we really can't really know human effects on the environment unless we look at atomic detonations, which extremely change the environment and modify it for 10,000 years. Basically, the time it takes for radiation to dissipate. But changing riverine fluxes clearly will change environments. So these are some of the things that scholars address worldwide in terms of what they look for in terms of noting that humans are changing or affecting the landscape. On the epoch we're in today, our Anthropocene, which is the human era, there was an acceleration of animal and plant species extinctions associated with human colonization of new landscapes. Humans are the prime contributing agents to extinction for at least 50,000 years because of the global pattern of human movement into new landscapes, migrations followed by climate change, overharvesting, invasive species that are brought with humans, and habitat disruption and even disease. So these are all effects directly attributable to human colonization in new landscapes. And there is a thought that in the late Quaternary, with extinctions of megafauna, it followed the arrival of humans 70 to 50,000 years ago in Africa, 15 to 10,000 years ago in North America. I kind of think that North American date is way too late. I think we can really look at maybe back as far as 30,000 years ago, where in North America there's 72 to 83% extinction of megafauna after humans arrive. And megafauna basically can't survive because humans change the land around them, either by setting fires, hunting their, or over harvesting foods. Megafauna with specialized diets are more susceptible to habitat changes. Things like mammoths, mastodons, camelids, giant sloths have these really sort of specialized diets, or that's what they're thought. Also, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, short-faced bears who feed on this megafauna also would be affected by changes. And then there's micro-environmental survivals, though, that we know up to maybe 3,000 years ago, there were woolly mammoths at Wrangel Island. So maybe they escaped some of these changes because they were on an island kind of remote from the mainland. And there are vegetation and pollen records that suggest that extinctions coincide with vegetation changes. So what is it that humans are doing? That's a good question. I mean, how do humans affect the environment? How do they make change to it? Is it agriculture? Is it setting fire to the land? Is it, over harvesting? What is happening? These are all good questions that many scholars are trying to answer today. About the megafauna, I want to go in this briefly. The Tualatin Kalapuyans actually have stories that I think are related to megafauna. They have stories of giant monsters. Sometimes you can crawl inside of them that have giant ribs. They're very scary. But linguists back in the 1920s and early 20th century, they collected stories of what appeared to be some sort of mammoth or monster at Wapato Lake called Amuluk, who had a spotted horn, kept dogs, and was fearsome to children. And the story itself, you know, the description with horns and, you know, spotted horns, very, very sort of large and inhabiting the lake, very, very much seems like it could easily be a mammoth or a mastodon creature, because we know that, you know, elephants have horns and mastodons have horns, and that elephants like to be sort of like in watery areas, in sort of marshy watery areas, or perhaps even, I have a little picture up here of what appears to be an old, you know, megafaunal rhino. I don't know what they're called, but they also have horns, so maybe it's one of those. And I think the story was used to sort of scare children from going into the water, because it was dangerous. Waters are always dangerous for children. But still, it could be what I think is maybe a racial memory of seeing the last or witnessing the last of the megafauna before they died off, perhaps even before the Ice Age. So there are some theories about what are the accelerants in what helps the Anthropocene take off. Basically, changes by could be caused by a mixture of climatic changes, human migrations, and ecological factors. There's perhaps a loss of keystone species like mammoths that actually help create environments. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the poo that's created by mammoths and mastodons in the Serengeti, or witness any of that, but there's whole ecosystems that live around just processing the excrement of some of these animals. I know that a lot of scholars believe that the bison of North America actually created the Great Plains by their activities. You know, they create their whole ecosystems are dependent on the bison themselves. Also, sort of warming trends could clearly affect environments. New human technologies, such as when humans adapted from perhaps just using knives to using spears to using bows and arrows. Bows and arrows are way more efficient for hunting, so that could cause sort of the hunting out of certain animals. This normally it's talked about as proceeding in a series of pulses, shorter periods of extinctions based on some slight change. Whether there's a slight technological advancement, there is a sudden warming trend that over a period of maybe 100 or 200 years, but some change happens where there's a pulse and all of a sudden everything changes. Most extinctions coincide with the arrival of humans in 3 continents within 30,000 years, nearly simultaneously, as many scholars have found. And in post-extinctions, there are still changes. Continued changes to vegetation and animal communities as they adapt to surviving in a new environment. A lack of predation, perhaps, by the die-off of predators means overgrowth. And so we see perhaps that happening in the Pacific Northwest forest today, where humans have destroyed many animals that would keep back the overgrowth, or the overgrowth of some other animals or plants. And so we're seeing overgrowth in many areas of the land because we've destroyed many environments through, I don't know, just direct construction, road building, or even just pollution could actually do that. Roundup could actually be one of the biggest destructors that we know, because I've recently heard that, you know, Roundup never goes away. It's in the environment forever. And people are now talking about how the many bird species around the world are just dying off, and there's less birds now than ever before. So that we could be looking at a significant pulse happening right now with the die-off of bird species. Also, post-extinction, you have increased fire regimes as there's overgrowth. Then in forests, maybe the animals that were eating them before died off, or maybe even insects that were eating them died off. Then you have less, you have much more fuel. Maybe the forests overgrow, and then you have things like major fires, catastrophic fires, which I think is exactly what's happening right now. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. Human anthropogenic burning of land causes really the whole landscape, the whole environment to select, through natural selection towards fire adapted landscapes. So it's really an evolved. So when you think about the Willamette Valley before white people settled here, it really was evolved landscape that evolved and was selected by humans to be what it was at that point. In time, human fire management would lessen the effects of fire. So I wanted to throw this little point in there that humans, by being the stewards of the land, were constantly managing the landscape, which would greatly overgrow if they didn't do so. So that is a technology and a way of thinking about the land that we have yet to sort of grasp as a way to go forward. And there are some other accelerants: early Holocene cultural transformation, human genetic manipulation of species or domestication, sedentary communities, human population growth, translocation of animals and plants, appearance and spread of new diseases, habitat alterations, accelerated waves of extinctions with human choices of the environment, intensified hunting, foraging, monospecies production, elimination of undesired plants or weeds, which are actually just diversity, and clearing large areas of natural vegetation, habitat destruction, land clearance, other human environmental impacts. So I'm not going to go through this whole list. The last one I have is colonization, which has a huge effect worldwide on lands when you remove tribal influences and impose other influence on land management. I think I'll skip over this stuff. I wanted to mention here, there's Christopher Columbus was a big, maybe began a big pulse of colonization when he discovers, perhaps is one word for it, the other word is happens upon a new world, new land that he'd never seen before, Europeans hadn't seen in a while. He creates a whole new desire for the wealth of this new land, and that creates another anthropogenic change because there's deforestation, there's destruction of native populations, and on down the line. So we've already talked somewhat about that, so I'm not going to go through all this stuff. We already talked about industrial revolution. Okay, so the Missoula Floods is perhaps one of the biggest catastrophic changes of all time for this area of the world. There may have been 16,000 to 11,000 years ago, hundreds of floods. I think scholars nowadays talk about hundreds, if not thousands, of different flood cycles that happened where glaciers were melted through warming trends or other means of perhaps a meteorite impact or something happened to sort of break the glaciers that were holding back, millions and millions of gallons, perhaps trillions of gallons of water from flowing into the ocean in the lake they call Lake Missoula. And so these floods from the east would come rushing down from basically the area of Montana through eastern Washington and rip off all the soil from the land and carry all that soil as particulates in the water down the Columbia River, carve out areas of the Columbia River, and then actually go into the Willamette Valley, fill up the Willamette Valley to a height of some 600 feet in some floods. And all those soils are then, as the water sort of still, those soils are all become particulates in the water and float down to the bottom. And they sort of fill up the valley with a whole new layer or layers, depending on how many floods there were, on the valley floor, covering river passages, covering native villages, probably killing many thousands of natives and animals and plants, and perhaps depositing new things in the valley that had never been here before. Perhaps seeds, perhaps other plants, perhaps animals, fishes, those kind of things. But it really, but by the floodwaters coming through the Columbia Gorge, they changed whole landforms. Scholars have thought that the Willamette Falls was carved out of by one of the floods, at least. And interesting enough, we're finding that there are actually tribal stories of witnessing the floodwaters, and the stories are dramatic enough. It's not possible they were just a 10-year or 100-year flood. They're too large, too dramatic, too life-changing to have just been a minor thing. So let's go move on to those. So here we have the Columbia River oral tradition, where there's Wishpoosh. And I won't read this whole story; it's kind of long. But Wishpoosh was a beaver, a giant beaver, and coyote were fighting, and they fought all the way down through the Columbia River and carved out the Columbia Gorge by their fighting, the tail of the beaver and the fighting action. And when they did this, the water rushed out of the lake and rushed down the Columbia, and from that water, from that action, was created all of the dead Wishpoosh, which created all of the tribes of the area. So it's a pretty interesting story. It's kind of a origin story of many of the tribes in the Columbia, and it's clear from my reading that Coyote and Wishpoosh, the fighting of the beaver and Coyote, which is a great trickster god figure, is kind of an explanation for what's happening. And people didn't know anything about glaciers much. They didn't know about, the earth movements at the time. So they tried to explain it through other mythical means. And I think this is a story of people witnessing the Missoula Floods and trying to explain what happened. And they believe that that great torrent of water that came down and maybe carved out the gorge, if people saw that, may have been the actions of gods, the fighting of some gods. There's other stories I've been finding recently. I've done a little bit of research recently into some notes. And there's Snoqualmie has a story, they say a long time ago, Mount Adams and Mount Tacoma had a quarrel, which ended in their fighting by throwing rocks at each other. A rock fired by Mount Adams knocked off Mount Tacoma's head, and immediately a great gush of water came out of the neck, which flooded all the country. Tacoma's head was washed away and now forms the Olympic Mountains. At this time, the Tawana people lived in the country just west of Mount Tacoma. Most of them were drowned, but some escaped in a raft. When the water receded, they found themselves on what is now known as the Olympic Mountains. Afterwards, they came down and settled the country where they are now. So this quite easily could be actually two stories. It's pretty clear that sometimes when you have mountains quarreling, the most geological explanation of that would be sort of volcanic eruptions. And we have a couple stories with the Klamath and other tribes where two mountains are erupting at one time. And the way you explain that would be that the mountains are fighting each other. And then there's this great gush of water. So perhaps it is sort of mixed up with this idea of a big flood came through and sort of washed the people away. And sometimes on the lower coast, they call it, and the tops of the mountains float on the waves. And we see that quite a bit in stories. Let me move on to the next one. Next story, this story relates about tribes being drifted. They say some held on to ropes to the tops of high mountains, but many tribes were displaced. The Tillamook are washed from the interior to the Lewis River. The Sewall floated around till they hit against the mountains at the head of the Chehalis and Willapa. At the time, the Quileute and Chimacum lived together in one people. The Chimacum anchored themselves, but the Quileute were washed away to the country they now inhabit. The version of the story from the Toano is as follows. The Toano drifted against the tops of the Himalaya Mountains where they tied themselves to a rock with a rope. It's a very common story. We found that people escaped the tops of mountains and to sort of survive the torrent floodwaters, and tying yourself to the top of the mountain is a pretty common theme in many of these stories. So it looks like these could easily be flood stories. It's too much to the interior to be a tsunami, so it has to be something else going on. So here's kind of a graphic of what this may have looked like. So we see glacial Lake Missoula way over to the east, and other lakes that have been named since: Lake Lewis, Lake Condon, Lake Allison, which was a Willamette Valley. And these are the areas that would have filled up in various locations as the warming trend happened and as the glaciers were receding. We also have Kalapuyan stories. I think I talked a little bit about this last time, but I'll talk about it again. This story is called Panther, Coyote, and Whale's Daughter, the Flood and Obtaining the Fire. The water flood came up, rose, and some people with large birds carried them up on their backs. They took them to a big mountain, Mary's Peak. All these people went to that big mountain there. Now the water was kind of higher. All the country was filled with water. Now all the people were running along. They climbed up a big mountain. Now it was that in that one loftiest mountain, then all the people got up to there. Now the water pretty nearly got to the top of the mountain. Then those people said to Panther, "What have you taken? The water does not want to go back to recede." And so he said, "I took nothing. I took only my child. I took this woman's hair." "Oh," the people said, "throw away that hair and maybe of hers. Maybe it is that which is pursuing." So Panther told him, "Throw that hair into the water." Sure enough, Chicken Hawk threw the hair into the water, and be sure the water went down, it went back, it receded. So pretty dramatic flood to have to go to the top of Mary's Peak to escape it. There's lots and lots of sort of mountains ringing the valley, also lots of buttes that are over 600 feet high. So like we said last week, or was it the week before? I can't remember now. It's clear that there are plenty of places to escape in the valley where people could have gone to the tops of these buttes or mountains or hills and escaped the floodwaters from one or more Missoula floods. So these are really interesting stories. And what do they mean? So it's interesting. They're eyewitness accounts of and experiences with the floods, which caused new understandings of human adaptation and massive environmental changes. So as we reinterpret these things, we get new understandings of what humans were doing. Displaced people, massive depopulation, yet survival of stories and culture. How much of the culture did survive? How much did it change? It's interesting these stories survived for perhaps thousands of years. Animal plant communities are affected. Some animal species may have died out. Waterborne species could have colonized the valley, especially plant species born through seed and bulb distribution. These things would not have been necessarily destroyed in the waters. They would have been particulates of the water, just like anything else. And so it could easily have distributed or brought new species to Willamette Valley that never had been here before. And so what were the soils like previous to the floods? What was the culture like? I mean, have we gone that deep? I mean, some areas of the valley are 90 feet or more deep of soils. So we just don't know, by and large, what's underneath those Missoula flood soils. What changed with the floods? How did humans adapt to thousands of years of maybe constant annual floods? Interesting question. Camas cooking technologies appear to have been developed around 8,000 years ago. Is this a technological leap for the Kalapuyans? Was camas a newly introduced or revitalized plant in the valley? So that's an interesting question about camas. Are there more ancient areas like buttes and foothill areas where Kalapuyan civilizations predate the floods? I have lots of questions about the buttes. I mean, can we go to the buttes and find these earlier records of Kalapuyans that predate the flood, so we'd have a pre-flood culture, perhaps? And what other key questions should we be asking? Lots of questions here. So TEK, which I think most of you really have become really interested in recently, is not really a new concept. It's an old concept. It's basically how we steward land. I have a little definition here that describes Aboriginal, Indigenous, or other forms of traditional knowledges, regulating stewardship, management, sustainability of local resources, and traditional knowledge carriers interact spiritually, philosophically, and materially with the world around them as a living set of organisms that respond to one another in numerous ways. Kind of a lot of words there, but basically that means that the tribes believe, many people that are traditional practitioners with traditional knowledge and carry that with them, they believe the landscape is living, that there are spirits everywhere, and that we are interacting with sort of a living, breathing organism, a landscape. Camas is a sort of major plant associated with Kalapuyans, and again, we wonder how long it's been here, but it is a major crop for the Willamette Valley, and all the tribes sort of harvested it, and they based their whole culture around camas. So these little bulbs are very nutritious. They sustain populations for a very long time, and it was a great trade item. You can actually take it up to Willamette Falls and trade for salmon. So we know that it was a major, major crop, not just in Oregon, but throughout the Northwest and even into California, because there's even records of it. Tribes using getting camas down in California, perhaps not as much, because for whatever reason we have great soils. Our river environments are a major asset in our area. The river environments allow people to travel really fast up and down the valleys. They also provide a variety of landscapes for getting food and resources for people to survive. And people had sort of knowledge about these landscapes and knew how to read the land around them to know when there were fish going to run in the river. They would also set, traps in the river to catch fish, and would harvest anything they could from the river, hunt ducks, hunt waterfowl, hunt mammals of the water. It was a major landscape for the area. Wapato Lake was a major resource in the area. It's now since been drained. It's being sort of recreated by the Army Corps of Engineers. But Wapato Lake was a huge lake. You see the map over here. This is basically over by Gaston, Oregon, outside of Hillsboro. And so major lake complex where there may have been upwards of a dozen tribal villages in the area. The Tualatin people lived there. And the potato was, or it's called an Indian potato also. Wapato was very much liked by many settlers that came here. So it was a major, major resource that has since sort of gone away because much of the landscape was changed by farmers and changed by river changes and changed by pollution and water boats and everything else coming through there that sort of destroyed the plants and then destroyed their environment. Tules and cattails are also another sort of major crop. Tribes would sort of harvest them to make these mats out of. The mats, you could make any kind of sort of living facility out of them. You could sleep on them. You could make walls out of them. You could make even a house out of them. So they were a pretty major crop, and those are also, many of their environments were destroyed by changes to the environment, pollution, by herbicides, by all kinds of things that we do today that have modified and changed the environment that tribes used for thousands of years. The prairie environments, the oak savannas were a major crop for the tribes. That clearly has gone downhill. There's not as much oak savanna there used to be. We have certain areas where there's a lot of it, and certain areas with absolutely none. Some are surviving. The oaks are pretty good survivors. They actually do survive fire very well, and actually produce a bumper crop the next year after the fire is done. So it's a major food crop, and also some more camas here. And the foothills have tons of resources. You start to begin to see, so cedars appear, berries are appearing, and elk are sort of hiding in the foothills. And so we have lots of sort of bush plants like the hazelnuts, or sometimes we call them filberts here. And those were the wild ones, were very much liked by the tribes and were gathered and eaten as well. So these are all sort of native food plants that tribes accessed on a regular occasion every single year as part of their seasonal round. The mountain environments were clearly also used. In the midsummer, tribes would travel up into the mountains to get berries, to also get things like bear grass, and maybe if they needed some planks off a tree, they could pull some planks off a tree because they knew how to do that, or they need some bark. Or many tribes, would go in the mountains, but they used them more for trade. And so we see the Klamath and the tribes that would come through the area on what's called Klamath trade trails, and they would do some hunting while they're camping through the mountains, and then they would come out of the mountains and hunt in the valleys, hang out in the Willamette Valley, but they're using more for trade than anything else. Lots and lots of berry plants in the mountains, so much so that it really attracted like every single tribe to at least have one trip in the mountains every year. Lots of blueberries, lots of huckleberries, lots of blackberries, salmon berries, all kinds of berries were made or available in the forest, and that really attracted the tribes. Tribes didn't have any agriculture here, but we did have what we call horticulture, so some sort of limited modification of the plants. Burning clearly is a major modification. You burn off all the old plants, but really in the month, the plants start back in, start reviving themselves, so it doesn't really affect them that badly. It actually has a renewing effect to the landscape. Pruning plants, lots of hazels were pruned, were cut down, and so they would have a nice straight growth next year. So there was some ownership of land, like some tribes would own areas of oak savanna or camas fields, and so they managed it for their families for perhaps hundreds of years. Some soil tillage. There's a suggestion among many tribes, like the Clackamas, that they would till little bits of soil to plant tobacco. And so there's a native tobacco from this area, which since has kind of gone missing. We don't really see much of it very much. It may have been dependent on humans to survive. Some fertilization. Tribes knew that if you plant animals in the ground, that the fish in the ground, that the plants would grow better. So there's some of that. Selective harvesting. There's stories of women and children harvesting camas, and they would not take all the bulbs; they only take the largest bulbs and throw the smallest bulbs back into the ground. Also, it was always the case, you never take all the berries on a plant. You leave some for the animals and some for the birds and some for other things. There are these cases of perhaps vegetative replanting where we find camas planted up as high as 3,000 to 4,000 feet in the Cascades, and a lot of folks are wondering how they get there. There are a few vast fields up in that area, and maybe it's the case that some Kalapuyans realize that if you replant this camas at a higher elevation, then you'll have camas when you go up into the mountains to hunt or gather berries. You can actually then harvest camas that you've actually pre-planted years before. So transplanting, and then seeding, perhaps using seeds in the same way, transporting seeds from place to place and then replanting them, knowing that eventually another plant would grow. So Kalapuyan tribes were very sort of peaceful, sort of wild harvesters, and seem to sort of depend really more on a plant cycle for the annual cycles than worry so much about hunting or fishing cycles. So their diet was probably very heavy in vegetables. I'm guessing 75% of their diet was probably vegetables as opposed to meats, because really vegetables were really dependable in this valley. Fruits are very dependable in the area. And so you didn't have to worry so much about always hunting or always fishing, because you always had vegetables around you in the valley. So the Kalapuyan Anthropocene is a time period era when humans affected the earth in measurable, observable ways, or the Kalapuyans did. Likely 8,000 years ago, the Kalapuyans began anthropogenic fire, has been discussed by archaeologists, to manage their lands. And this roughly approximates the same time as we see camas use go up. Camas ovens begin to develop in the valley. So maybe they realized that it would spur camas growth in the fields. And fire then chooses plants that survive, right? So the plants that are above ground are going to be burned. The plants that have bulbs and tubers underground are going to survive because those bulbs are going to survive underground. Also, some of the hardier plants like the oaks are going to survive, whereas the pines and firs and even cedars would not survive on the valley floor with regular annual firing in the valley. So fire is actually choosing which plants are going to survive in many, many ways. So the oak savanna is then an anthropogenic landscape meant to produce acorns as food. Many tribes knew that if you burn the land, the oaks that were touched by fire would produce more acorns the next year. So that was always desirable. So they would set fire to it, hopefully that they would have a lot of sort of like extra crops the next year from the oak savanna. So fire then renews the prairie for root crops, and the tribes implemented plans on the sort of annual cycle, which call the seasonal round, in what we call environmental stewardship, or TEK. Here's my little fire picture, and we see that, Jesse Applegate, one of the earlier settlers, came through, and he sort of witnessed fire happening in the Salt Creek Gap over on the west side of the valley. And so he saw Native women setting fire and then burning through the landscape every year. What's interesting is he doesn't mention that their houses burned down, which means that the fires were not so bad that it would destroy the landscape and destroy their houses and destroy everything. So it's a very interesting omission in his story, because I would think that if the fire that was burning was a pretty hot fire and pretty devastating, he would have mentioned his fire burned down. So removing the tribes from the landscape actually changes the environment, doesn't it? And these are what we're talking about here, settlement changes. The removal of native stewardship practices from the land causes changes in land management and reduction and elimination of animal and plant species by agriculture, and affects the domesticated animals within 10 years of settlement. So removing that influence, removing the firing, stopping native people from gathering their foods, and then putting agriculture into their prairies destroys the landscape for food for the tribes. And so that is a double effect in anthropogenic change. There's a reduction of game and fish through settler hunting and fishing, reduction of freedom to travel anywhere because farmers have fenced the land, loss of rights, sovereignty, and freedom to live culturally as you want, as tribes want. And then eventually the tribes become labeled pests or need to get rid of, so they're moved to reservations. The majority of the valley floor becomes agricultural fields, monocropping, and further destruction of terrestrial animal and plant environments. There are also changes to rivers, river flows, leveeing, damming, dredging, and mill races change environments and native species further. And plants that had become dependent on human stewardship change or disappear. The original assumed pristine environment disappears to become an agricultural industrial resource base. So we are now 180 years into our, what I call the Oregon colonization pulse. It's this anthropogenic change due to the colonization of Oregon. Massive fire regimes are happening right now, this year, due to poorly managed forests that have not seen regular annual fires to eliminate excess trees and excess fuels. and other things, like some of the forestry practices are planting trees too close together. And I think that the Tillamook burn was a warning. Tillamook burns happened over a period of 30 or 40 years, but they were kind of warnings because native people were stopped from burning the landscape in the 1850s, and it took 50 years or more for all of a sudden there to be massive fires in the Tillamook area. Native species continued to decline, are continuing to decline today. Now climate change makes everything warmer, causing climatic changes, odd seasons, warmer summers, warm winds, and new weather patterns, increased storms, floods, and increased cyclonic activity. We now see increased extinction of species crowded out by industrialization and without enough natural habitat to survive, and due to human predation and increased development on undeveloped lands. What we need, I think, is changes in our philosophies about land stewardship, planning into the 100-year to 200-year horizons. I mean, how do we help things survive for 200 years? Increase protections for existing habitat for species, increase barriers to destruction of native species and remaining environments, controlled stewardship of the environment in realistic manners or ways, accessing cultural lessons from native peoples who know how to steward the landscape for long-term management. And we have stories, we have ways of thinking about the land that may be helpful. And then additional scientific methods that meld with native philosophies of land stewardship. So we're clearly going to need a lot of help to help the land survive. So native people annually access and use the environment, honor and respect the animals and plants, and inanimate words for freely given of their lives and spirits that we might live. So that's my little comment, my little presentation. And I think I'm going to be open for questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. That was wonderful and so much information. And it looks like we do have a couple of questions here. So if people have questions, feel free. There's a Q&A box. There's a button down at the bottom of your screen that you can click, and it opens up a Q&A box. So feel free to type it in there, and I'm going to help moderate some of these questions. So
Taking about 10 minutes to read this one question. So.
What's that?
I'm taking about 10 minutes to read this one question.
Yes, this first question.
What is it saying? Let's see.
Yeah, so essentially given the long history of human influence extinctions going back maybe 70,000 years around the world and 30,000 in North America, and the deep conservation / traditional ecological knowledge of Northwest indigenous cultures dating back at least 10 to 15,000 years, can you point to some of the things that contributed to the learning and understanding that emerged to slow the pace of human-caused extinction?
You know, that's a great question. I think that, you know, I'm not really an expert on the Anthropocene. I mean, I've read some stuff about it. There are likely scholars that know much more about this than I do. But what I would say is that when I've thought about this, that since humans sort of modified to change the landscape, that we see that, you know, fires beginning happening on a regular basis 8,000 years ago, I think stability was created by a fire-created landscape. I think that there were still likely to be extinctions, and setting fire to the landscape really caused those extinctions to probably happen faster. But then what was created was this more stable environment in the end. So it's really hard to say what went away. We probably have to consult with some archaeologists that look at animal species and plant species of the past, and maybe can figure out how humans are involved in it. But I would assume that fires sort of stop that. And the other question is
a little bit shorter. What were the Tillamook fires and when did they occur?
So Tillamook burns began right around 1900, a little bit after. And I think they continued in the 1940s. So there was some 40 years of them. There were a number of them. And they basically destroyed much of the Tillamook forest. What we think about as the Tillamook forest, which is basically all BLM land and the lands over there. burned up right up to the edge of the Grand Ronde Valley, and it was hugely destructive. There's lots and lots of pictures of burned down forest trees, and it was it burned so deeply that you could tell that those trees are not coming back. They clearly burned so extreme that they're not going to survive. So it basically created these sort of wastelands over there, probably because the fuels had sort of built up to the point that it burnt more deeply, burnt longer in one area, and it killed the trees rather than just going through and burning like the surface areas. So what this is from Ellie, what resources would you recommend for someone who wants to learn more about land stewardship? Well, there's hundreds of books now about this. You can look it up on Amazon. I actually have been looking at a couple books. Let's see, I'll recommend a couple. There's one called Tending the Wild. I don't know if you can see this. It's called Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. It's a pretty good book that talks about sort of California ways of managing the landscape. Has lots of good lessons in here. There are lots of books now being written by Native peoples about their own sort of ethnobotany. I think Patty Warat Phillips is the one sort of Oregon Native author that's written from a Coos perspective, and it's called Ethnobotany of the Coos, Laurentian, and Siuslaw peoples. It's a pretty good book. So there's lots of books out there that talk about sort of traditional land practices. Yeah. Is there more?
There are, yeah. So the next one is thinking about older native plants and how colonizing influences. How can watershed councils do a better job of supporting native landscapes, especially as climate change is rapidly accelerating? Great question.
Yeah, I think part of the problem I've seen, I'm not necessarily with your organization, but with other organizations, has been, I think folks sort of key in on sort of one species they want to save, maybe the oak savanna or salmon or whatever it is, and I think that really planning has to happen in a holistic way, where you think about the relationships between the animals, plants, and how they can best sort of restore the whole environment. Try and figure out what is the keystone species, what is sort of what will help everything else sort of like survive, and how. And probably the best thing you can do is limit human interaction with the landscape. There was a case a couple of years ago where this really sort of remote landscape in the Cascades was revealed as this sort of clear, sort of like pond that had this really nice sort of waterfall going into it. And all of a sudden, everybody on the internet was talking about this great place they wanted to go visit. And I knew that immediately what's going to happen is they're going to pollute the place and destroy, the ecosystem, because they're inviting everybody and their brother to come to that place. I think you need to find ways to sort of manage the human effect on the landscape. I think that's the best thing you can do.
There's a question in the chat box too that maybe ties into that. It says, it's from Sarah. You recommend that we access cultural lessons and meld scientific methods. How do we go about this in a respectful way?
Well, I think that the problem I've noticed with a lot of environmental scientists, they don't really think about Native peoples as having knowledge, and it's been a thing. I've noticed that a lot of discussions about the environment, about even climate change, is really a scientific discussion, and a lot of times the Native peoples and their perspectives on these things are dismissed or placed in sort of the sideshow area, where they're not really respected, even though we have these stories about people living through climate change, right? So I think what you have to do is invite Native peoples, people that have knowledge, not just any Native person, but people that actually have knowledge, onto your boards or onto your planning committees or into your process, so that it makes a stronger project overall if you basically have as many different kinds of perspectives as you can in your project. If you only have one perspective, the scientific perspective, that makes it very apt to perhaps not get everything right.
Great.
We have another question. Heavy diet. Heavy
Yeah.
diet in camas. You want to read it? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, the heavy diet in camas apparently can produce a lot of intestinal gas due to indigestible carbohydrates. David Douglas reported in Indian head I was almost blown by the force of the wind. Or tradition or other history about this effect. Yeah, so the remedy for it is to cook the camas. I mean, literally, that's it. I mean, I remember that David Douglas quote, and I've used it quite a bit in my classes to sort of wow my students and say, hey, if you really want to eat the camas, go ahead, but don't be afraid of the gas that comes out afterwards. So, but really, the tribes never would eat raw camas. They would always cook it. And generally, there's two ways of cooking it. You can either cook it like a potato for a half an hour on the stove. It comes out kind of squishy, and you could probably mix it with potatoes if you want to. Or what they would normally do is cook it in like a kind of an oven-like atmosphere for a couple days, and it transforms the proteins into something more digestible to humans, and you no longer have gas. So you really have to go through that chemical change in order to make it more acceptable to the human diet. Nowadays, you can do that in a crock pot. You just get some camas and you cook it like for 2 or 3 days in the crock pot on low heat. And once the camas turns this like kind of golden brown, then it's ready to go.
Nice. All right. Oh, and maybe a final question, unless other people have some. What does camas taste like?
Well, it's actually a little bit sweet. If you cook it the second way I mentioned, it does have a very sweet, pleasant flavor. If you cook it right, I've seen it cook wrong. It's not good at all. But I've actually cooked it also on the stove, like in water, like potatoes, and it kind of is spongy and squishy. It's edible, but it doesn't have as good a sweetest flavor as the other way.
Nice. All right, and I highly recommend, if people haven't checked out David's website, I will link it here in the chat, to check out. There's just a trove of information there. So if you have more burning questions, of course, feel free to reach out. We can always, with David to forward more questions, but I highly recommend looking at his website and just digging into some of the research that's already done there.
Great, that's it, yeah.
All right, everyone. It's very dark in my office. It must be quitting time. I just want to thank David for his tremendous stories and wisdom. Every time I listen to David, I learn lots of new things. I want to just end with a quote that David mentioned during our last talk was, "The knowledge that Native cultural people carry is needed to truly understand how to manage our environment." And I think that that's something that we need to sort of take away from this talk and some of the lessons that we learned this evening. So thank you as always, David. It's great to have conversations with you, and I just love watching you swim at the base of Silver Falls.
I've never been there into the basin, but it'd be kind of fun.
So again, thanks all for those who joined us this evening. We are happy to accept your donation on our website if you enjoyed tonight's Fermenting Ideas. This event is going to be recorded or is being recorded. We'll share those with those who registered. And lastly, our next upcoming event is the Wild and Scenic Film Festival, which is November 19th at 7 p.m. So please join us for Wild and Scenic, and have a great evening. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.